Now, as the fighting persists in the Gaza Strip, Professor Rebecca Gould from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London says she has been branded as an anti-Semite for criticizing Israel's occupation of Palestine. She joins us now to discuss her experience. Prof, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Could you firstly share with us your experience or incidents that have led to your voice of criticism of Israel's occupation of Palestine?
Certainly. Thanks for having me. So this story dates back several years, actually, into 2017, which is when the UK adopted, it became the first country in the world to adopt what is called the IHRA, or the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And this is a new definition of anti-Semitism that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. That's not... Well, that wasn't the general understanding, a few decades ago. And so I had just arrived at a UK university, the University of Bristol, and a student came across one of my articles that I'd written while I was living in the occupied territories in Bethlehem. I'd been a postdoctoral fellow there, and I was very critical of the occupation and of apartheid in Israel. And so that article was actually from a few years previously, but the student found it very problematic. The student self-described as a Zionist, and that led to there was a sort of public controversy about it, particularly the right-wing media thought that I should be removed from my position. Ultimately, I do want to say that I had very good legal support, and I have a lot of support, so I didn't experience, termination or anything like that. Ultimately, the university decided in my favor. But I think it does raise the question of why should just an article that is against racism and apartheid ever, fall into this trap of being accused of anti-Semitism.
I want us to expand a bit more on the repercussions you faced. What were the immediate repercussions after publishing your article called Beyond Anti-Semitism? And how did it impact your professional and also your personal life?
Well, I think the first impact was kind of psychological. I mean, I had never been accused of anti-Semitism, I am of Jewish heritage myself, so it never occurred to me, that I could be seen in that way. And it was quite shocking to me that that accusation was being made. So there was a trauma associated with that too, because I'm against anti-Semitism, I'm against racism. And also the second effect was just the kind of stress of, for 6 or 7 months, I went on medical leave. I didn't know, what my future held, because once one is kind of branded in that way, often there's no way back. Your career is over. I would say I was one of the lucky ones. I think there are people who have suffered a lot more than I have, and their names, they need to be remembered. But I was also one of the first. It was one of the first cases. In fact, my situation in 2017 was the first instance in the UK when this definition of anti-Semitism had been applied. And so I think that's also important to understanding the history of what's going on. Right.
But how did you respond to the accusations that were leveled against you? And also, what measures did you take to defend your position and academic freedom as well?
Well, I think it took me had an initial period of just not knowing what to do. And the best thing I did was to reach out to a law firm that has Bindman's law firm. They have a wonderful track record in terms of defending human rights and speaking up for Palestinian rights. And so that was a game changer. I mean, they understood, that there is enshrined in UK legal proceedings a right to freedom of expression, whereas I think a lot of the university administrators didn't understand that. And so I was able, I sort of spoke through them. I mean, I just kind of,
Right.
Since I went to hiding a little bit, and I just let them guide the proceedings. But at the same time, I also went on a journey in terms of trying to understand. I was just interested in the fact that I was being accused of anti-Semitism. So I learned myself, I educated myself on how is it that people could have perceived this as anti-Semitic.
Maybe let's get into that. I mean, your article mentions the concept of privilege in relation to the Holocaust narrative within Israel. Could you elaborate on how you see this privilege operating in the discourse surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, the problem is that there is, the state narrative in Israel is so dominant, and so the trauma of 6 million Jews being murdered in the Holocaust has become kind of instrumentalized by the state. And I think whenever that happens, whenever some kind of trauma becomes part of the defense of a party that's in power, there are going to be problems. There are going to be deception and manipulation, and what really struck me when I wrote that article was that there are a lot of Jews in Israel who are making that criticism and making that complaint and saying essentially what cannot be said in the UK or the US. But I heard that, left-wing Jews on the radio were making these same points that I made in my article. So it didn't strike me at the time when I was living there. It was within the bounds, of what was being said.
So can you shed some light on the challenges faced by academics and activists who critique Israel policies towards Palestine, particularly in terms of facing accusations of being anti-Semites?
Right. Well, I think it's happening as we see in connection with the war in Gaza. It's just the cases are just proliferating. They're almost out of control, and it's getting very difficult to track everything. But just a few weeks ago, there was the case of Hassan al-Hajj at Max Planck Institute. He was officially terminated in a very public way from his fellowship by that institution. At Indiana University Bloomington, there was a professor named Abdul Qadir Sino who all he did was he organized a meeting, and he didn't follow the procedures in terms of filing the right paperwork. It was with the Palestine Students for Justice in Palestine. Again, he was suspended. So I think what we see is interesting because universities are kind of often resorting to these kinds of excuses about bureaucratic excuses. You didn't file the paperwork. They're not acknowledging that actually, the reason is that they're talking about Palestine. That's where they're being fired and suspended. Mm-hmm.
Professor Gould, how do you view the role of academic institutions and also the broader academic community in really fostering open discourse, especially on contentious issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while also ensuring academic freedom and also integrity? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think academics need to kind of rethink their role. We aren't here to serve power. We aren't here to just copy what the government is saying and supporting that. And the problem is that the institutions within which we work often do see the role of the academic in that way. Yet there is a long and I think very important tradition of intellectuals like Edward Said, who was a professor, but he was a professor who wasn't afraid to criticize the administration or to criticize biases in his surroundings. And so I think that's the first thing is we do need to think more about the role of the intellectual, the role of the academic, and draw also on a very long and important tradition of anti-Zionism, in the Jewish tradition, in the Palestinian tradition. It's not, it's the opposite of racism, but I think it's worth kind of going back to the sources like Hassan Kanafani or one thinker who I write a lot about in my book is Abraham Leon, a very, very courageous Jewish anti-Zionist who was killed in Auschwitz. So I think we kind of need to construct a tradition for ourselves, a role for ourselves in this new situation.
As we wrap up our conversation, but also looking back on your personal experience, what lessons have you learned about the intersection of free speech, academic freedom, and also political activism in academia?
It's a great question. At first, I was very traumatized by the accusations that were being made against me. But then as I gradually, I learned to kind of find my voice and realize I'm not anti-Semitic. I felt that I began to learn, that there is a kind of empowerment that comes with speaking out. And I think that at least I'm speaking specifically of the UK and the US. These are worlds in which I think people take free speech for granted, particularly because it's often a kind of right-wing talking point. And so I personally had lost a sight of that it actually can be liberating. And I think that my experience of being silenced and persecuted and then being in solidarity with others around the world who are silenced and persecuted reminded me that there is a long tradition of free speech as a struggle for liberation that I think we should bring alive today.
Professor Gould, thank you so much for joining us as we delved into the complex and often contentious topic of Israel's occupation of Palestine with Professor Rebecca Gould from the School of Oriental and African Studies, this at the University of London. She's been giving us her experience as well.